All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the Whetstone. It's a really powerful framework for mentorship. The whole thing is based on a simple, kind of ancient idea. Just like iron sharpens iron, we as people can sharpen each other. So, before we jump into the how, we got to ask, what's the problem we're even talking about here? The framework starts by asking what it actually means for a man to be unsharpened. So what we're talking about is a man who's, well, unsharpened. Think dull, lethargic, basically someone who's just not prepared for what life's going to throw at him and who's ineffective when it's time to step up and lead. It's really about untapped potential.
Okay, so here's our game plan for how to counter this. We're going to look at the stone and the blade, the three pillars of mentorship, something called closing the hypocrisy gap, what this looks like in the real world, and finally, the professional's response.
So the whole thing really boils down to this relationship between two key players, the stone and the blade. And this isn't just a nice-sounding metaphor. It's actually a practical model for how this whole thing is supposed to work. You've got these two very different but super important roles. The stone, that's the mentor. He's older, he's got more experience, and he provides that hard surface for the sharpening to happen. Then you have the blade, the mentee. And through this process, he gets honed, becoming more dynamic, more effective, and ready to cut through whatever challenges life throws at him. And let's be clear, this isn't some accident. The whole point is to deliberately put on an edge for the younger guy, to really spark his appetite for truth, for taking on heavy responsibility, and for leadership.
Okay, so that's the big idea. But how does it actually work? Well, the whole process is built on these three essential pillars, kind of like the rules of the game that turn the metaphor into something real.
And they're super easy to remember: proximate, purposeful, and periodic. These are basically the operating instructions that make sure this is real mentorship, not just, grabbing a casual coffee. Let's dig into what each of these means.
So, first up, proximate. This means you gotta meet in person, for that kind of hard looks and straight talk that just doesn't work over an email or a text. Second, it has to be purposeful. This isn't just hanging out. Every single meeting has a specific goal: to give the blade the bricks he needs to build his own guardrails, those positive habits that will guide him.
And that brings us to the third P, periodic. The rhythm here is key. The meetings need to be consistent enough to actually make a difference, but you don't want it to be smothering. And this is so important because, let's be honest, this sharpening process can be uncomfortable, even painful. Without that regular contact, it's way too easy for the blade to just drift back to what's comfortable.
Now, you might be thinking this is a one-way street, right? That it's all about helping the mentee. But what's really fascinating is the huge impact it has on the mentor, too. And it all comes down to closing one critical gap.
It's called the hypocrisy gap. And we all know this one, don't we? It's that space between what we say we believe and what we actually do. This whole mentorship process is designed to shrink that gap for both of them.
See, it's a total two-way street. Of course, the blade gets that honed edge to become more effective. But the stone, the mentor, he gets something just as powerful. By teaching this stuff, he's forced to live up to his own words, right? It strengthens his own guardrails. The analogy to AA's 12th step is perfect here. Helping someone else is one of the best ways to solidify your own principles.
And man, think about how fast you can lose all that credibility. There's this incredible story about a speaker who, after talking for 45 minutes about self-control, just loses his cool for 30 seconds, and boom, in that one moment, everything he just said went right out the window. That right there is the hypocrisy gap in action.
All right, so this all sounds great in theory, but how does sharpening actually play out in the real world? Let's get practical and look at what it takes and where things can go wrong. Okay, for this whole thing to not just fall apart, both guys have to have the right mindset. The stone, the mentor, he has to be humble enough to talk about his own screw-ups. And the blade, he's got to be coachable. He has to actually want it. A mentor can't drag you to the finish line. He can't give you motivation. The blade has to show up ready to work.
A perfect example of a blade mindset is Michael Jordan. Think about this. At the absolute top of his game, he wasn't asking for compliments. He was saying, I want you to tell me about the fouls. I want you to tell me how many shots I missed. That's someone who is hungry to get better.
And you see this same idea everywhere, especially in the professional world. In sales, for instance, a huge part of being sharpened is learning when to shut up and listen. The ideal ratio they talk about is something like 70% listening, 30% talking. Why? Because if you just create that space, people will often tell you exactly what you need to know.
But, and this is a big but for any mentor listening, there's a huge warning here for the stone. You have to stay humble. It's so easy to start thinking you've got it all figured out. But you have to remember that in some other part of your life, you're still a blade. We're all still getting sharpened one way or another.
So this brings us to the big question, right? What's the point of all this? What's the ultimate goal of all this sharpening?
And here's something really important to get. This whole journey, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Honestly, sometimes just showing up day after day and not sliding backward, that itself is a huge win. Because really, it all comes down to this one simple but powerful idea. Amateurs react, professionals respond. See, amateurs are just pulled along by their instincts, but professionals, they respond with intention. The whole point of being sharpened is to create that tiny little bit of space between something happening to you and your reaction. Because in that little gap, that's where your power is.
And so that's really the question this whole framework leaves us with. In that moment, that space between experience and reaction, how are you going to choose to respond?